Right then, good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you for joining us for what month are we in? June. June's Twilight Talk, which is number 9 that we've run, I believe. And yeah, they're quite good fun. Quite enjoying getting new topics in and sort of seeing new people through the door. So thanks for joining us this evening. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Julia, who's a sort of friend of mine and somebody I've known for 5 years, maybe. Julia, we met 5 years ago at a conference, and sort of a colleague and friend of yours, Tony Caravan, as well. Lucy is with us tonight as well, so there's a lot of Green Register people here. So if you have any questions for any of us, please put them in the chat, and I will sort of interrupt and ask questions as and when it's appropriate for the speakers. As with all Zoom events that we run, please try and keep yourself on mute, and we can sort of unmute you depending on sort of conversation that happens and things like that, but it just helps reduce background noise. It is great to see people if you want to display videos, but obviously a lot of people are still at home, so privacy is always sort of good as well. So whatever works for you guys. And I think we've got 20 people so far, so I guess we'll crack on, and then if we get more people, we can have them join in a bit. I'll hand over to you, Julia.
Thanks, Seb. Evening, everyone. My name's Julia Bennett. I work 2 days a week with Green Register, developing training. And I also have my own low carbon architecture practice up in the Cotswolds. So tonight we're going to take a very quick whirl through a couple of emerging and very engaging subjects. I'm going to talk about the Living Building Challenge, which comes from the International Living Future Institute. And Tony will then give us the benefit of some of his recent learning and practice on regenerative design. Next slide, thank you. So let's go right back to the 1970s. This man, Barry Commoner, wrote a book called The Closing Circle. And in that, he talked about the 4 laws of ecology. Everything is connected. Everything must go somewhere. There's no waste. Nature knows best. So if we mess up with human technology, it might not be positive for the system. And there's no such thing as a free lunch. So exploiting nature will inevitably involve conversion of resources from useful to useless forms. And when we're talking about circular ways of building and having it in the economy, it's very important that we think about retaining materials and resources in as close to their original state as we can. And then he was actually talking at the time about how the US economy should be restructured to conform to the unbending laws of ecology. I'm not sure we've made an awful lot of progress on that since then, but it's still a very valid comment from my point of view. Next. And then more recently, we have these United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which have been very successful in working their way through lots of different measures and processes for sustainability, including the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge. And some of the ones in orange are the ones that relate to the work that we do in the construction sector. We're not going to dwell on that just now, but it's just really useful to see how different frameworks are coming to the fore to help us change our behaviors. Next. So one of the things that is part of the inquiry is that we have a responsibility within the ecosystem. And the way I think about things is that we've lost the balance of that. And one of my questions is always, what is ours to do to try and recharge and rebalance that? Next. We started back at the Brundtland definition, back at the Rio Earth Summit, talking about sustainable for round about the first time. That was when it came into common parlance and governments were signing up to things. And this shows some of the buzzwords that have come along since. And this man, Martin Brown, who is one of the founder members of the Living Building Challenge in Europe, but also an incredibly impressive thinker about moving from sustainability towards regenerative ways of thinking, put together this quite interesting diagram. So you can see carbon reduction on the left-hand side, moving through to LEED and Passive House and BREEAM. Then we move into the restorative, so talking about how we might restore the system from the negative impacts that we've created. And then moving further on to this regenerative agenda, where we're actually trying to make a net positive impact. Next. This slide is quite interesting. I fall foul of this myself, where we can get quite fixed on carbon and energy in the way that we talk about buildings and development and retrofit. But it's actually quite useful just to see this and remember that there's so much more to sustainability and regenerative approaches. Next. So again, two diagrams that just help us understand where we are in thinking about sustainability, and that on the left-hand side, at the top, business as usual or negative environmental impacts. So we can go through things like building regulations to being perhaps super green or very high performance, until we get to the balance point in the middle of both of these diagrams, where we sort of call it sustainable. And it means that we're not doing any further harm, but we're not necessarily doing any good. And both of these diagrams suggest that there's territory we need to move into to make net positive gains. Next. So this is the man who started the International Living Future Institute, an architect and planner from Seattle back in 2006. And the mission is to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest time possible, but without ecological offense or disadvantage of anyone. So anyone for me means any part of the ecosystem. And working towards communities that are socially just, culturally rich, and ecologically restorative. Those are the three firm tenets throughout the whole of the Living Building Challenge. Next. So let's come to the framework of the Living Building Challenge itself. The Living Building Challenge sits within the Institute for Living Future, the International Living Future Institute programs. And this diagram shows some of the ones that relate to buildings. And you can see that Living Building Challenge is on the right, and it's the one that is the most onerous. But there are other steps in the process that you can gain certification for buildings. Next. They also have these really interesting labels. So you can get a reveal label, which actually reveals the energy performance of your building or project. So a bit like EPDs or not so much EPCs, but actually a very simple format. It's a bit like ingredients on food packaging, but in a more graphic way. And you are actually declaring exactly what's going on. And then in the middle, the declare is all about the life expectancy, the end of life options for the materials. It's about the individual ingredients that are in your building, and being very open and honest about the supply chain, where those things have come from. And then on the right-hand side, this is about organizations. So people that are involved in either being clients or involved in the process of delivering buildings. And it's about social justice. So going back to one of those first three tenets. And some of you might not be able to see the detail, but it's like a little code. So some of the titles are diversity and inclusion, employee benefits, equity, stewardship, employee health, and purchasing and supply chain. So it's a way of people being able to see incredibly quickly in the label how just and how far the progression towards being a just organization is. Next. So let's come to the Living Building Challenge itself. It's constantly being updated. It's a living standard. Next. And it boils down to a familiar format to the things we've been used to with things like BREEAM, where there are certain sections and you have to meet the requirements of each section. And in this case, they're called petals. And it's all about those things again: sustainability, which is limiting impact; restorative, which is restoring things back to a healthy state, but pushing on towards regenerative, where we're evolving a net positive outcome. Next. And for those of you that have ever been involved in permaculture, you might recognize that there are quite a lot of overlaps with this. And because permaculture is very regenerative, perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised. Next. So as I said, the whole thing is an iterative process. There are constant updates, and they're really quite major sometimes from year to year. And the process of running the project, most of us are used to being involved in design projects with iterative cycles. And this profound kind of conversation about what does good look like, and it's changing every year, every day. What we understand by what does good look like, and it's a conversation that is very positive for us to keep on having. Next. So in the UK, we have 3 projects that have achieved some kind of certification. This one is a visitor centre in near Preston. It involves straw bale construction. So Barbara Jones from the School of Natural Building was involved, and Martin Brown, that I mentioned earlier, was the Living Building Challenge consultant for it. And the clients just cannot believe how successful a building it is, and were absolutely over the moon with the results. We don't have very much detail on exactly the documentation for the challenge, but it's an exciting building to visit. Next. 2 other buildings in the UK. One is a private dwelling in Devon, which was a retrofit to Living Building principles. And the Google office in London achieved, you can see there's a little circle at the bottom, and for those with small screens, it says certified zero carbon. So when I showed you the steps of different certification you can get, this building got zero carbon. It's not the full set of petals. But nevertheless, good effort to do something in London. But there are many people getting more and more interested in the Living Building Challenge framework. So I think probably the case studies will start to come through in greater numbers. Next. One of the first things you have to do when you're assessing a project for Living Building Challenge is use this diagram. And I can't pronounce the name of the company that I'm not even going to try, because there might be somebody in the audience that would laugh out loud who knows how to say it. Let's try it. Duane Plater Zyberk. That's quite American way of doing it, isn't it? But they created this diagram, which kind of it's a typology of the context, the landscape context in which your project is. And Living Building Challenge has taken this on board. So one of the first things you do is make sure you understand in which transect, it's called a land transect, which goes from rural on the left to urban on the right. I hope it's a fuzzy diagram in every piece of ILFI Living Institute material, so I apologize if it looks a bit out of focus. Next. And then coming to the project typology itself, the intention is that Living Building Challenge can be applied to any project. So it's not just brand new buildings, it's retrofit, and it's not just offices, it's community structures, interiors, Communities can take up a challenge, or new construction, multifamily residential, all the way through the typologies, as well as landscape and infrastructure. Next. So let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty of how it's structured. So here in the diagram on the right-hand side, the titles on the left of the diagram are the petals that we've already seen. And then within each petal, it's broken down into imperatives. So this is the sort of the language that you get familiar with when you're looking at Living Building Challenge. So for example, the first one is place, and there are 4 units, and this is where it looks a bit similar to BREEAM, so some of you might be familiar, but the key elements that you have to meet the requirements for are ecology of place, urban agriculture, habitat exchange, and human scaled living, and so on. And then there are these interesting symbols alongside them. So a core imperative, which is the green donut, means that in order to get any of the certifications, you must meet the requirements of that imperative. And then the one that is an orange square is called scale jumping. And that means that, for example, if you're dealing with a block within a town or a city, that there might be things that you're doing that connect with each other in different buildings within the block, so that there's an overlap, and there might be optimal benefits by sharing. So for example, ground source heat pumps in district social housing, you might put one ground source heat pump borehole in order to get renewable energy, but it might be shared by 4 terraced houses. And so you're allowed to get the credits for that, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? And then hand printing, which it's only on a couple of the imperatives in the diagram, acknowledges that sometimes projects can have benefits outside the boundaries of the specific contract or building project. So for example, there was a school project where there was a water course running through the site, and the students got so involved in the whole Living Building Challenge approach that they started noticing the quality of the water in the stream on their site. And then they started making improvements and cleaning it and filtering the rubbish, collecting the rubbish out of it. So it had become culturally a positive thing that the building project was Living Building Challenge, and it had had an influence on the way that the humans were behaving for the benefit of the ecological system. Next. And when you join the Institute, you get access to the handbooks that detail all of the requirements, and they're absolutely beautiful books. But they're also quite scary when you first look at them, because the requirements they're pushing us well beyond the bounds of what we're normally doing in design practice. Next. We'll have a quick look at the energy petal. I'd love to go through all of them, but in the time that we've got, we're not able to do that. But obviously, we can be in touch if you want to have a chat about things afterwards. So the energy petal, it has 2 imperatives. One is energy and carbon reduction, and one is net positive carbon. And energy and carbon reduction is a core imperative, and both of them can be scale jumped. And it's focused on relying on renewable resources, which in the current context is something that is coming to the fore a lot more, and I think clients are going to be asking for it a lot more. Next. And within the imperatives, this is what some of the requirement looks like. This is just a summary. There's an awful lot of detail in the Petal Handbook, but you can see that a new building would have to have a 70% reduction from an equivalent building baseline. Combustion limits and renewables. So there are very clear graphics and diagrams that help us absorb some of the very technical detail. Next. And it's also a living building challenge is performance based. So some of us have been trying to work with post-occupancy evaluation for years, and it can be quite difficult to make it happen. So this is absolutely based on the outcome of how the building is used and how it performs is a very significant element of whether you get your living building challenge certification or not. And you can see this is quite an American diagram because they call autumn fall, but you can also see that if the commissioning, what it's saying here is the performance period may be delayed until the systems function as designed. So if you've got that kind of zone where the commissioning of building systems is not quite right, and sometimes you have to go through a heating season in our climate to find out whether things are working, your performance period for living building challenge doesn't start until that's sorted. So it's very thorough. Next. Here are just two of the front covers of the specific zero energy and zero carbon, which are the two lowest steps, not necessarily low in any hierarchy sense, but just in the height of the steps on the diagram I showed you. So you can get zero energy certification and you can get zero carbon certification. And that building, the Google building in London, got the zero energy certification. Next. So just to recap, these are the petals. Each section has got an awful lot of detail in it. It takes you on a journey and it challenges every decision that you make. But fundamentally, it starts with the ecology and the relationship with the site. So one of the things that they say is that this idea of doing, sitting in a waiting room somewhere, pulling out, or in a restaurant, pulling out a pen and doing a concept scribble for a project on a napkin is completely anathema to the way that Living Building Challenge works. You start with the site, listening, understanding, doing a reference ecology and biodiversity study. We're more used to working with ecology in planning terms, in terms of planning applications, where there are sites of special interest. But this says that you do it for every site because you won't know what impact you're having if you haven't checked. It's a bit like doing a baseline energy model if you're doing a retrofit for passive house standard. You need to know what you've got to start with. Next. So that was an incredibly quick run through, and these are just some of the publications that are very inspiring at the moment. So on the left, Future Restorative has been a major program, and Martin Brown has written this very inspiring book which encapsulates some of it. And it followed on from the one in the middle, which talks more about that journey between what we understand as sustainable, moving on to restorative and then regenerative. And then that neatly follows on to introducing Tony, who is going to talk to us about regenerative development and design.
Thanks, Julia. That was seamless. I didn't know that was going to be there. Anyway, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to share your presentation. So there will be some points I think will be overlapping with Julia's presentation, but I just want to very briefly outline what I believe is an approach to regenerative design and development that is truly regenerative. So I haven't studied the living building challenge in much detail, but I can certainly see that the two work very much hand in glove. With the living building challenge perhaps being more material specific and project specific, whereas the approach I'll be outlining is more about, if you like, the early stages and how one sort of approaches a project within a greater context. So first, very briefly, is about my background. I've been a practicing architect for 36 years. I got interested in environmental issues back in the late 80s in Bristol, and was in fact was around when Green Register was set up by Lucy. So I've got a bit of history there. So since then, I've had quite a bit of experience working in private practice, large and small, and even ran my own green building architecture practice for 10 years. More recently, I've worked for a local authority for 15 years, but currently have my own consultancy, project managing, advising on regeneration and construction for the expansion of a major UK biodynamic health and beauty company. Over the last few years, with all that's been happening in the world, I've been drawn to engaging regeneratively at a larger scale, beyond this just individual buildings, in areas such as landscape restoration, biodiversity recovery, as well as buildings themselves. And for me, this is really this learning journey I've been on has been about systems and interconnectedness. So my recent work has really been about working more with these systems and perhaps individual buildings. Next slide, please. So this is a slightly different version of Julia's diagram she showed earlier. But what it does show is we do need a rapid shift from technical to living systems. So on the right-hand side is where we've been, and some still are, to be honest, in conventional or even with a very technically orientated system design. Where the balance point seems to come is sustainability, and my own work over the years has sort of followed that pattern, if you like. I first started to describe myself as green, and then ecological and sustainable. But now I'm recognizing that sustainability really is, in its broadest terms, is about status quo. And if the status quo is not actually in a good form, healthy, then it's not going to really last. So that takes us on to restorative, which in a way is trying to rectify the damage that's been done. But really what we should be looking at, I feel, is regenerative, which is really not just making things better, but actually recognizing what is inherent in a place in the system, working with that to really create and allow the evolution of those living systems. So living systems thinking has been around for many decades, but the construction industry, unfortunately, is still largely locked into linear and technological ways of thinking. By working with living systems and how they want to develop, we can create greater vitality and resilience. And as the diagram shows there, actually use less energy. You're working with the flow, as it were, what the place and what the system wants to be rather than working against it. The problem, I think, in the construction industry is many of us have not been trained that way and still are not being trained that way. And the current construction culture still focuses on action and products. And Julia's lovely example about the napkin, the inspired image of a project is just so antithetical to what we're trying to talk about here and achieve. So many projects are still unfortunately stuck in the technocratic system of design. And this is really based on a linear thinking system. And this leads, as we know from so many times, problems and unforeseen events. So basically our systems are not very resilient. And I think we've seen that over the last few years about how things have gone with COVID and supply chain problems. So in essence, it's really about a way of thinking and being as it is doing. Next slide, please. So this slide sort of builds a bit on what we've just been talking about. On the bottom axis there, we've got the integration of human consciousness. It's really about how we think about how we relate to the world about us and to nature, which we, of course, are part, not our part. But that manifests in different, if you like, terminologies. So when you look at the vertical scale there, the pattern harmonization, you're really talking about what levels of organization of systems. So biophilia could be characterized as saying it's basically a smaller scale. And as you grow in size and outlook, you eventually end up with regenerative development, which is really looking at the whole of Gaia. It's quite a daunting task in a sense, if you look at it that way. But the methodology that I've certainly learned and involved with gives you frameworks that help you sort of think around that and approach it. So it goes beyond human-centric design to nature-centric, and it engages the systems and patterns they hold at much wider scales because they're all interlinked. To isolate the separatist linear thinking that's characterized so much of capitalist and industrialist society is not working anymore. And we know now why that is. So next slide, please. So Julia showed this earlier as well. When I read this book, this is really what I came across last year. So when I read this book, it brought together so much of what I've been looking for and learned from the work of many others I've been reading about and leading thinkers, as well as my wife, over the last decade or so. And to me, their approach that's embodied in the book there has really addressed much of what I feel was wrong, or even about advanced sustainable design. So on the back of reading the book there, I took the course and graduated last December. And since then, I've been working with a wide group of fellow graduates and practitioners in an enlarging community. And one of the great things I think about the course there, is that it is a community. People, I wouldn't say necessarily get evangelical about it, but I think it's so transformative for people that they want to feel the need to continue to engage and develop their practice, both individually and collectively. So just very, very briefly, they were formed, 27 years ago, interestingly from permaculture and ecological design, but also involved psychological inputs and business, alternative business approach. So it draws on quite a few disciplines, which I think has made it all the more appealing, certainly to me. It's based mostly in the States, and a lot of the examples they give in there are drawn from that. But I think as more and more people join up, we have people all over the world now practicing with this approach. Next slide, please. So this is a short intro into some of the ideas that we'll be exploring. And this is Bill Reed, who's one of the founders. So if you'd like to start the...
Hi, I'm Bill Reed with Regenerative out of Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm going to answer the question about how the sustainable built environment can support the development of resilient, and I would add regenerative communities in kind of an indirect way. The buildings, of course, are a significant contribution to climate change and other damages to our environment. And yet the way to begin to transform our cities and culture is through a longer lived interaction with the community that the buildings and infrastructure are part of. So the way that we use real estate projects as an acupuncture point to engage community in a transformation process to help them engage in an integrated way to support the work in their communities and ecosystems. So you get a double bang for the buck when you're working with green buildings if you actually think about the larger system that the community is part of, and how the real estate project can function as an energizer and as well as a long-lived practice to begin to engage community as collaborative problem solvers, and even better than problem solvers, working on the potential for health in the community itself. That potential, that larger vessel, holds the problems that everybody else, all these different activist groups and interest groups are addressing. And what the real estate projects allow are the time to practice working together in a new way for a meaningful and larger than just a single project benefit to the community.
Thank you. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So as Bill was describing, building projects should be seen as an opportunity to create more life and resilience in the place in which it is embedded. Yet how often are we expected to produce a design right at the start of a project, as we've said before? And when we finish work on a project, how often do we see it as something fixed and complete? In reality, the building is part of a system that continues to evolve over time. It's not fixed. And thus we need to see the project as a co-creator of that evolving system of place. It is a process. And as Bill referred to there, it is very much engaging with local people, with stakeholders as co-creators, not as people one has to placate or to necessarily please, but co-creators. So design should therefore be the final outcome of working the process through, not the start. Otherwise, you're imposing a solution that will not necessarily fit, or at least not fully manifest the potential of place. So I can't stress this more enough. We're so trained to think in terms of product of a visible, physical entity. Really, what we're trying to engage with is the process. How does all this come about? What is trying to come through? And the building, if you like, is the end of that process rather than the starting point. Next slide, please. So this is another very key aspect of their approach. And again, Julia did mention that as part of the Living Building Challenge. But it certainly goes against the ethos of the international style, a much commercial building that goes on at the moment. Systems happen in places, they don't happen in an abstract space. Because we and the natural systems influence and are influenced by what is around us and interacts with us and the patterns they play out. So think of the impact of being on a mountain or in a desert or in a city. This is not just localism as a nice idea. It is the reality of how living systems work and create the diversity of an inherent part of cosmic evolution. So each place is unique and it changes. It is a living system. So the first work is to find out what is the place in which the project sits. And for me personally, this was the most appealing aspect and chimed very much with what I did in my own work, which was really investigating the history of places, seeing the patterns that play out over time through social, historical, physical characteristics of a place. So what are the patterns that the living system of this place guides and repeats through time? So who are the actors, the agents and stakeholders who will be involved in the system's evolution? And how big is it? What is of this system? What are its boundaries? And how does it fit within the greater system? Next slide, please. So nature is organized in living systems, and the living system is a set of interconnected elements with a certain function that create their own pattern of behavior. So for me, a good example is you think of a tree in a forest. The tree itself is a system with a whole host of creatures, some large and some tiny. Yet as we know, trees are interconnected with each other by a vast array of microrhizomes, fungi and other organisms, as well as the obvious ones above ground. So nothing is in isolation. Systems operate within themselves, but then they also are within, they sometimes incorporate smaller systems, and they also are part of larger systems. And the same goes with our buildings and developments. They don't operate in isolation. They sit within a place or a system that serve much of its needs. And that system sits within a larger system, say a watershed or a bioregion. The systems scale up and down, and what we term as nested. And in a healthy system, each level draws from and feeds into the systems from above and below. So this could be seen why many extractive industries, such as coal mining, are not sustainable long term, because they no longer feed into the larger system, and the larger system doesn't actually feed into them. Next slide, please. So this is for me again another critical aspect of the approach, and it's probably one which is very rarely sort of seems to feature, certainly in the construction industry and approach to development. It's about inner and outer transformation. So as Einstein famously said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So we have to address problems or projects with new ways of thinking. Otherwise, we end up repeating ourselves and just creating more problems. And think how the pandemic has changed our worldview about interconnectedness. So for me, this is the most radical, exciting, but challenging part of the Regenesis approach. So it's not just change our way of thinking so that we can really see the potential in a project, but also it's for us to develop as individuals and teams along with the system of which we are working. The Regenesis process places huge emphasis upon inner development, who we are and how we work on projects. So we need to be able to reimagine how we work and who we are at work. And just think about that process. It's the mindsets we bring to things. So we have to be consciously aware of who we are. We have to be conscious throughout that process and not just repeating patterns from the past because they may have worked in that circumstance, but is by no means a guarantee of working in the future. The most challenging aspect of the course, I think, is that constantly forcing yourself to look at how you are responding to a situation. If you get, for instance, in a community meeting, if you get angry or upset by something, then that is not going to help the process. You need to see yourself, almost stand outside of yourself and see how that impacts upon both your own behaviors and activities and also those of others. So really, but ultimately, this is about trying to develop capability to integrate these insights into our work. And in short, the approach is trying to enable us to develop capabilities within ourselves and the system we are operating in, to manifest potential as a source of higher order value, and to create a vitalizing energy field to enable the evolution of living systems and life on our planet. Next slide, please. So this is the end of the presentation, but for those who are interested, Regenesis do have a very well-resourced website. There's a number of videos, papers, and things that you can have a look. It does offer training courses, as I've mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, this year's course has just started, probably by a week or two, but if anyone is really interested, they could try and maybe join, because it does last for about 6 months. Otherwise, they'll have to wait till next year, when they'll probably be doing a new run. So I think that's, if anyone has any further questions beyond the session today, then by all means contact me at the email address there. Otherwise, thank you, and Julia and I will open up to questions.
So I think, Julia, you've been, by the looks of it, active in the chat as we've been going along. So I'm sort of leaving you to that side of things. Now, I remember actually when I met you 5 years ago or so, I was at a conference, and I think it was actually during a talk on biophilia, which I did spot in one of Tony's slides as a title, but it's something that I expect is sort of directly related to the Living Building Challenge, or at least is almost like a byproduct of the Living Building Challenge. And at the risk of putting you on the spot, do you know of any more? At the time, I saw some studies about biophilia in hospital settings and its effect on recovery times and things like that. Is there more sort of research being done into that, I assume?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got open the Petal handbooks because Vela would quite like to have a look at the equity one and have a look at the universal access, but I'll just divert from that and just see if I can track the biophilia, which is in the beauty and joy petal. Bear with me a second. Talk amongst yourselves.
And biophilia, just as a, can you give us a definition of that, Tony? I don't actually know what the definition is off the top of my head. I've sort of always seen it in the context of the effect that nature has on human welfare, basically.
Yeah, I think like a lot of these terms, there's so many definitions now that they tend to lose perhaps some of their potency or focus. But so I don't have one off pat, as it were. But I think certainly biophilia, certainly is me, is that the appeal and positive impact of connection with nature that it has on people. So, I mean, I hope the people didn't get the impression that it was denigrating the benefits of biophilia. It's just the scale at which it operates is very much, a small scale. It's it's individual or personal based.
So
yeah,
I'm just
been a lot of work, obviously, with COVID. And so many articles have been written now about the benefits, the mental health benefits, and obviously social prescribing for nature connection.
So here I'm just sorry, I'm scrolling up through the Petal handbook in a PDF, and this is the section on beauty and biophilia. So these are some of the requirements. So how the project will be transformed by deliberately incorporating nature through environmental features, light and space. How the project will be transformed by deliberately incorporating nature's patterns, and how the project will be uniquely connected to place, climate, culture. The project must meaningfully integrate public art and contain design features intended solely for human delight. Somewhere in the dim, distant past, delight was a really important part of architectural design. Culture, spirit, and place. So this is the sort of resource that you get when you're looking at trying to meet one of the imperatives. And some of the case studies are very inspiring. Sadly, I haven't got the photographs here. The Petal handbooks are much less graphic than the website because they're obviously trying to get into the technical nitty-gritty. But here's an example of one that they're case studying. So this is in Vancouver, a botanical garden visitor center, and you can see, you can feel the kind of biophilic approach. And let's see, we've got an energy lab in Hawaii, and a pavilion. So a lot of American examples, because they've been dealing with it since 2006 over there, and it feels like it's quite fresh here. So let me go back to Vela's request for, sorry, I'm scrolling. I know it's horrible when you're looking at Zoom, and just find the equity. I think it's 288, there it is, 388. So the equity petal is all about supporting the just, equitable world, and part of that are the inclusion, universal access, so requirements as you might expect, include things like the spatial universal access, but also in the non-building transactions, the non-building interactions. So that picture that was at the beginning there is about universal access to the natural, the sense of nature within the context of the building. Fresh air, sunlight, natural waterways, these are all things no project may block access to, nor diminish the quality of fresh air, sunlight, and natural waterways for any member of society or adjacent developments. Pretty challenging stuff. I'm going to stop sharing simply because it gets a bit eye-googling when people are scrolling through documents on screen.
Cool. We are past 6 o'clock, so I'm aware that people will be drifting off, and we have lost a few people already. So before we go, or before more people drift off, thank you very much for presenting, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm happy to leave this running if people do want to chat a little bit more, or of course get in touch. The Green Register has a new website live at the moment. We actually launched that, was it last week or the week before? It's all blurred into one. But if anybody is having problems with it, please contact me directly. It's me frantically mashing my keyboard in the back end, hoping that it resolves issues. So I am available. And other than that, hopefully we'll see you again soon. As I say, I can leave this running, that's fine. But I wanted to just clarify, round off a few things. So
Great, thanks
over to you
everybody.
guys.
Thanks for looking after us, Seb and Sarah.
Yeah, thanks. Nice job.